Harper. So have you guys ever had a weird, discussion with yourself? Just out of the blue, thought, what would I do if there was a crocodile in my room right now? How would I fight it off? How would I defend myself? No? Me neither. Video.
While Septimius had been preoccupied with the civil war, the Parthians had attacked the new province of...
Okay, hold on. I want to just click this up. I know you're going to... Why are you doing that, Kris? You're going to drop it back down. Of course I am. Probably. I'm drinking. Oh, I shouldn't be doing this. But I'm doing it anyways. Video. And this is the last
of Mesopotamia,
video.
Laying siege to Nisibis. Cassius Dio records, they had also come very near seizing Nisibis, and would have succeeded had not Latus, who was besieged there, saved the place. Measures were taken to ensure the favour of the urban populace at Rome with more lavish games and further distribution of largesse before Septimius set off for the east. Embarking at Brundisium, the imperial retinue sailed directly across to Asia Minor. On arrival in Syria, Septimius mustered his forces and headed straight towards Nisibis. The Parthians retreated before he arrived. With the Parthians driven off, he moved back to Syria to prepare for a much more ambitious campaign against the Parthian heartland itself. In the late summer of 197, Septimius invaded Parthia. He was accompanied by a brother of the Parthian king. The Parthians put up minimal resistance, and before the year was up, Septimius took the Parthian capital of Ctesiphon. He permitted his soldiers to plunder the entire city, and on the 28th of January 198, Septimius proclaimed that he had conquered all of Parthia. An auspicious date indeed, for it was exactly a century since Trajan's ascension to the imperial throne. Trajan...
Is it just me, or does that Caesar Nerva, does it have a slight resemblance to Dave Bautista? Drax from Guardians of the Galaxy. That is Dave Bautista. Damn time travelers.
Himself, of course, had delivered a smashing victory over the Parthians. Unfortunately for Septimius, he would also fail to capture Hatra, just as Trajan himself failed to seize the city 90 years earlier. Following this campaign, Septimius' eldest son, Antoninus, was proclaimed co-Augustus with his father, and his younger son, Geta, was granted the title of Caesar. During the spring and summer of 198, Septimius devoted attention to reorganizing the eastern frontiers. He created a new province, Mesopotamia. Osrhoene was retained as a province too, with its capital now at Carrhae, which was given the rank of a Roman colony. The newly formed province of Mesopotamia was placed under an equestrian prefect with a legionary garrison of the newly formed Legio I and III Parthica. With Syria strengthened behind two new provinces and the entire eastern frontier reorganized, Septimius set off for Alexandria. Septimius entered Egypt by land, stopping at Pelusium, where he sacrificed at the tomb of Pompey. Hadrian had rebuilt the tomb on his visit in 130 AD. The Historia Augusta records that Severus himself continually avowed that he had found this journey very enjoyable, because he had taken part in the worship of the god Serapis, had learned something of antiquity, and had seen unfamiliar animals and strange places. He visited Memphis, Memnon, the pyramids, and the labyrinth, and examined them all with great care. The province of Egypt needed reform, It had supported his rival Niger, just as it had earlier backed Avidius Cassius during Marcus Aurelius's rule. During Commodus, there had been as many as 10 prefects in 13 years. The principal change Septimius enacted during his stay was to grant a senate to Alexandria, a function all cities in the empire possessed. To Italy.
Why didn't Alexandria have a senate? Anyone?
Africa and back. Septimius and his imperial entourage left Egypt for Syria, probably towards the end of the year 200. His precise whereabouts during the year 201 are not known, but it seems he spent most of his time in Syria. He was set to be consul with his son, Antoninus, for the following year 202. His son was only 13 years old at the time, and they inaugurated the year as consuls in Antioch, before they finally set off for Rome. While in Bithynia, Septimius erected a tomb for Hannibal, who had died in a place in Bithynia called Libycia. Septimius considered Hannibal to be his fellow countryman, as they were both Punic in origin. Septimius's Decanalia, his 10-year anniversary of attaining the imperial throne, was approaching, and he wanted to be in Rome for this event. He returned to Rome after 5 years' absence, and games of the most spectacular kind imaginable were put on to honour the Decanalia and Parthian victories.
Now, he was put in power for 10 years, correct? So he's going back probably expecting that he's going to be voted back in, or whatever the process is.
He stayed in Rome only for a short time before he set off for an inspection of his native province of Africa, and especially Tripolitania and Leptis Magna. His hometown was granted ius Italicanum, which meant that Leptis was tax-exempt and treated as if it was a part of Italy. The city honoured Septimius with a monumental quadrifon's arch over one of the major crossroads in the city, which is still largely intact today. Septimius launched a campaign against
That's pretty cool.
the Garamantians just south of Tripolitania in 202. Aurelius Victor records that he freed Tripolitania, the region from which he came, from fear of attack by crushing most warlike tribes. Plautianus was one of Septimius's most senior advisors. He was the sole prefect of the imperial bodyguard, and his daughter was married to Septimius's eldest son, Antoninus. Plautianus was himself a native of Leptis Magna. They probably knew each other from youth, but for some reason, Septimius became displeased with him around this time. According to Dio, Septimius was annoyed at the number of statues that were set up to Plautianus. The Historia Augusta claims that Plautianus had placed his own statue among those of his kinsmen and relatives. Septimius declared him a public enemy and melted his bronze statues, but soon relented. However, some in official position else melted down some Plautianus' statues and paid a heavy price. The imperial entourage returned to Rome in 203 and probably celebrated an ovation for the campaign against the Garamantians. The triumphal arch Septimius was awarded following his first war in the east was now completed and dedicated. The magnificent arch still dominates the Forum in Rome today. It was dedicated on account of the restoration of the Republic and the extension of the empire of the Roman people by their outstanding virtues at home and abroad.
Interesting.
The Septisodium was complete in 203 as well, resembling a nymphaeum, facing Via Appia right below the Palatine Hill. In 205, Antoninus plotted the removal of Plautianus. He enlisted 3 centurions who presented themselves to Septimius and informed him that they had been ordered by Plautianus to kill both emperors, Septimius and Antoninus. Septimius immediately summoned Plautianus. He spoke to him in a mild tone, merely asking him why he wanted to kill them. As Plautianus began to proclaim his innocence, Antoninus rushed up and seized Plautianus' sword and struck him with his fist. He wanted to kill him with his own hands, but Septimius restrained him. Antoninus then ordered one of the attendants to strike him down. A brigand named Bulla ravaged Italy around this time. He had attracted a great number of runaway imperial freedmen. Perhaps some of these brigands were the ex-guardsmen Septimius discharged at the onset of his reign, as well as some lowly employees from the imperial estates, who now turned to brigandage. The problem was not new, but the Marcomannic Wars, the Deserters' War under Commodus, and finally the civil wars of 193 to 7 had clearly made it more serious. Expedition Britannica. Septimius saw his sons becoming undisciplined and the armies slack through idleness. He wanted to get his sons away from Rome so they would behave better under military discipline after being removed from the life of luxury at Rome.
Yeah. Your kids, they're not going to have the hard life you had, or you had to take the emperor. Then you were voted in. You know, I'm going to give him that. But then you had to fight, you had to conquer, and now what you have, your kids are inheriting. And they're not going to have that, I don't want to say work ethic, but they're not going to have that determination to, they're not going to have that work ethic and determination to put in the effort to rule, because they don't understand all the stuff that happens behind the scenes. And by that I mean all the people who are trying to kill you. They're not going to understand any of that because it's just, they've never had to deal with it. Dealing with senators. I mean, I can't pretend to understand. I can only just go by what I'm seeing. But yeah, I mean, you're raising your kids to feel like this is theirs, and they haven't earned it. Deserved it.
When he received a letter from the governor of Britain, Alphinus Senecio, who wrote that the barbarians were in rebellion, laying waste to the countryside, carrying off plunder and wrecking almost everything. That gave him the pretext needed to carry out a campaign in Caledonia. An imperial expedition, a full-scale Roman invasion of North Britain, the like of which had never been seen before, was planned. Agricola did carry out an offensive campaign in northern Britain, what is now Scotland, but his conquests were abandoned by Emperor Domitian. In 208, Septimius Severus was 63 years old, and for one last time, the restless and impatient emperor was riding off for war. But for most of the journey, he...
Wow.
With Google Pixel, your phone, buds, and watch are seamlessly connected and intuitively helpful. Switch
63 years old. Wow.
For most of the journey, he was carried in a litter, as he was by now suffering from gout or arthritis. Herodian records that the Britons were disconcerted by the emperor's sudden arrival, and realizing that this huge army had been assembled to make war upon them, the Britons sent envoys to Severus to discuss terms of peace, anxious to make amends for their previous errors. Seeking to prolong the war as to avoid a quick return to Rome, and still wishing to gain a victory over the Britons, and the title of honour too, Severus dismissed the envoys, refusing their offers, and continued his preparations for the war. Septimius established his headquarters at Iberacum. Geta, his youngest son, was left in the Roman part of the island to administer justice and carry on the civil government of the empire, as Septimius and Antoninus launched the invasion across Hadrian's Wall in 209. Cassius Dio records, as he advanced through the countryside, he experienced countless hardships in cutting down the forests, levelling the heights, filling up the swamps, and bridging the rivers. But he fought no battle, and beheld no enemy in battle array. The enemy purposely put sheep and cattle in front of the soldiers for them to seize, in order that they might be lured on still further, until they were worn out. For in fact, the water caused great suffering to the Romans, and when they became scattered, they would be attacked. Then, unable to walk, they would be slain by their own men in order to avoid capture. The The written record claims that he reached the extremity of Britain. Septimius must be envisaged as going at least to the Moray Firth, where he could reasonably enough claim to have reached the extremity of Britain. And that's what the archaeological evidence suggests as well. Roman camps have been found up until that point. The biggest of these camps cover an area of 120 acres. With the scale of the marching camps found in Scotland, it's evident that Septimius planned for a permanent occupation of northern Britain. Later propaganda, after Septimius's death, asserted that the purpose of his expedition had been to strengthen existing frontier fortifications in conjunction with a punitive campaign. Cassius Dio records a very interesting event during the campaign. When both were riding forward to meet the Caledonians in order to receive their arms and discuss the details of the truce, Antoninus attempted to kill his father outright with his own hand. They were proceeding on horseback, Severus also being mounted, in spite of the fact that he had somewhat strained his feet as the result of an infirmity, and the rest of the army was following. The enemy's force were likewise spectators. At this juncture, while all were proceeding in silence and in order, Antoninus reined in his horse and drew his sword, as if he were going to strike his father in the back. But the others who were riding with them, upon seeing this, cried out, and so Antoninus, in alarm, desisted from his attempt.
Wow.
Severus turned at their shout and saw the sword, yet he did not utter a word, but ascended the tribunal, finished what he had to do, and returned to headquarters. Then he summoned his son together with the Papinian and Castor, ordered a sword to be placed within easy reach, and upbraided the youth for having dared to do such a thing at all, and especially for having been on the point of committing so monstrous a crime in the sight of all, both the allies and the enemy. And finally he said, "Now if you really want to slay me, put me out of the way here, for you are strong, while I am an old man and prostrate. For if you do not shrink from the deed, but hesitate to murder me with your own hands, there is Papinian, the prefect, standing beside you, whom you can order to slay me, for surely he will do anything that you command, since you are virtually emperor." Though he spoke in this fashion, he nevertheless did Antoninus no harm, and that in spite of the fact that he had often blamed Marcus for not putting Commodus quietly out of the way, and that he had himself often threatened to act thus toward his son. Such threats, however, were always uttered under the influence of anger, whereas on the present occasion he allowed his love for his son to outweigh his love for his country, and yet in doing so he betrayed his other son, for he well knew what would happen. The Maetai and the Caledonians were the tribes that had caused the Roman frontier trouble in recent decades, and the peace Septimius had enforced on them was short-lived, as they soon reignited hostilities. Septimius decided on a punitive campaign of extermination. Quoting Homer, "Let no one escape utter destruction. Let no one escape our hands. Not even the babe in its mother's womb. If it be male, let not even this escape utter destruction." This campaign was launched in 210, ostensibly conducted by Antoninus alone, as Septimius was crippled by his illness and remained behind. Antoninus, however, paid little attention to the war, instead concentrating on winning the personal allegiance of the soldiers. Before Severus died, he is reported to have spoken to his sons. Cassius Dio notes, "I give his exact words without embellishment." Septimius said, "Be harmonious, enrich the soldiers, and scorn all other men." Geta was promoted to Augustus, making him co-emperor with Septimius and Antoninus. His older brother had been emperor for 12 years. During the winter of 210 to 11, Septimius's illness got worse, and on the 4th of February 211, at Iberacum, he died. According to Dio, his sickness carried him off on the 4th of February, not without some help, they say, from Antoninus. Whether Antoninus had anything to do with his father's death is impossible to know. He had clearly been ill for some time before his death and made preparations for it.
But because he's ill and he was preparing to die, the son could have gave a little help. That's, wow.
Herodian claims that Antoninus had the court doctors killed as soon as his father was dead because they had refused to obey his orders to hasten the old man's death.
Oh.
He showed himself to be a man of such energy that even as he expired, he gasped, "Come, give it to me, if we have anything to do." Cassius Dio. Final thoughts.
That's too
Here
bad.
is a single man who overthrew 3 emperors who were already in power, who gained control of the guard by a trick, who succeeded in killing Julianus, the emperor in the palace, Niger, who ruled the people of the East and had been saluted as emperor by the people of Rome, and Albinus, who had already the title and authority of a Caesar. This he did by virtue of his courage. One could not easily name his equal. Such was the verdict of Septimius's contemporary, Herodian. His reign is marked by his many military successes and his horrific purge of the Senate, following the civil war with Albinus. But the sources are less hostile towards Septimius for this act than one might expect. But it had been worse during Commodus, and would be worse again under Caracalla, so perhaps they saw him as the lesser of 2 evils. In many respects, Septimius seems to have emulated Marcus Aurelius, making his empress Mater Castrorum and his young son co-emperor, adopting an expansionist policy, spending long years with the armies. Cassius Dio, who knew Septimius personally, records, "He was a small man, but physically strong, although he did become very weak from gout. His mind was extremely keen and vigorous. He did not get as much education as he wanted, and because of this, he was a man of few words, although he had plenty of ideas. He extended the frontiers of the empire. In Africa, there was a new forward line, in Mauritania, Numidia, and Tripolitania. In the east, 2 new provinces beyond the Euphrates, the extension of Syria down the river and into the desert. Many before him had failed to conquer Mesopotamia, like Crassus, Mark Antony, and Trajan. Septimius's conquest proved to be successful and a permanent province of the empire, up until the Muslim conquest of the 7th century. The most damaging effect he had on the empire was his monetary policy. He unquestionably debased the currency to a far lower level than Marcus, or even Commodus had. His pay increase for the troops was made possible by this means, which resulted in far greater quantities of money in circulation. His reign was the longest of any emperor between the death of Marcus in 180 and the ascension of Diocletian in 284. The contemporaries of Severus, in the enjoyment of the peace and glory of his reign, forgave the cruelties by which it had been introduced. Edward Gibbon. Thanks for watching the video.
That was pretty good. It was interesting. It wasn't quite what I expected. I thought he was going to be in England more, based on what my understanding. But I wonder where he's buried. I could look it up. I'm not going to. That's your job. All right. I've had enough to drink. I'm good. You can tell. See the redness? That's what happens when I drink. I'm getting tired, too. I want tea. Why am I telling you? You don't care. You don't care about me at all. Chucky cares. Chuck Cheese. Okay. I'm going to end this. Like and subscribe, or you're going to have to tongue kiss a porcupine.